All right, guys. I'm back with lecture 9. As you see, I've entitled it Capitalism, Industrialization, and Class War, Marx and the Vision of a New Society Beyond Exploitation. So, what we were doing until this point in the last two lectures that I gave on the French Revolution, um, we talked about the creation of the first nation state in world history, which happens in the French Revolution. The idea of a society in which the people rule themselves and constitute a national will and national sovereignty on the basis that all individuals have essentially to rule themselves, which is part of our humanity and our human freedom. Um, in this lecture, which I'm going to break up into two parts, um, we're going to make a kind of segue. Once we've talked now about the coming of the nation state, we're going to make a segue to talk about how, despite this idea of this ideal notion of a collective will, right, that we all think for each other and that we make then laws for each other that are supposed to be to the best interests of everyone. Um, Despite this ideal of Rousseau, as I think all of you probably know, as all of us experience, even our nation states to this day are riven by all kinds of conflicts, very often class conflicts. And from very, very early on in the aftermath of the French Revolution, it became clear that the nation state was subject, that the people itself was subject to all kinds of internal conflicts. And so then the question is, when we say that people rule themselves, what do we actually mean, right? And these conflicts became ever more clear in the context of industrialization, right? As the conflicts increasingly manifested themselves as conflicts between people who have property and people who do not have property, right? So, what we're going to do is, like I say here, we have studied the way in which the French Revolution created the first nation state in world history and so put into practice the ideal of a collective national will. But this ideal of popular sovereignty, of rule by the people, was almost immediately confronted by a thorny problem. Who exactly are the people who are supposed to rule themselves? And uh, that question became ever more clear. It became ever more trenchant and obvious in the context of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, through which capitalism and markets expanded and became ever more globalized, also made it clear that the nation, the people, were in fact constituted by classes with conflicting interests, that the nation state was subject to class war. It is this world of industrial capitalism, the first society of sustained economic growth in human history, that is Marx's subject. But looking at the fact that this society of growth is actually a society of class conflict, Marx argues that a growth society not only makes possible, but necessitates the perfect society, a communist society beyond class conflict, beyond class exploitation. So, what Marx wants to talk about is how this industrial revolution that we're going to talk about today and is essentially an extension of the turn towards capitalism that we've already spoken about, how that revolution, which manifests itself in the context of class war and class conflict between those who have property and those who do not have property, how this shift, this new system of production will actually make it inevitable that will move to a society where those class conflicts actually disappear, and where, in fact, the nation state, so, already simply at the time Marx is writing the Communist Manifesto in 1848, something like 60 years old, how he thought that that form of government itself will actually also disappear, right? Where we'll have an international world, um, and one, a communist society in which there would be no classes, there would be no property, and ultimately there would not even be a state, right? Okay, so first we're going to go back to the French Revolution, and we're going to see what actually happens in the aftermath of the French Revolution. How the nation state, right, which comes into being in the French Revolution, comes to be characterized essentially by class conflict and class warfare. Okay, what you see in front of you, uh, this is the beheading of Louis the XVI. This happens in January 1793, right? And by looking at this, and some of you probably already, I'm sure a lot of you already knew that this is what happens to Louis the XVI, that he gets his head chopped off. But the fact that this is happening in 1793 should tell you that something has radically changed and gone wrong from where we left off our story of the French Revolution. Remember, we left it off with the Constituent Assembly getting together and deciding essentially on a constitution for the new French nation state, which they do by September 1791, where the constitution goes actually into effect, and there are elections, and there's voting for a new legislative assembly, right? But in that constitution, Louis the XVI, the king, is actually the executive, right? And here you see his head being chopped off. So you know something has gone wrong in the meanwhile, that the revolution has been radicalized. Um, and the thing is that already in July 1791, right? So even before the Constitution goes into effect, Louis XVI had tried to escape from France to try to go and join his brothers and a host of the aristocracy that had already essentially fled and had been pleading with all of the different monarchs around Europe, saying, look, what these people are doing in France, this is not just about us. It's not just that we are losing our power. They're completely changing the very notion of what is legitimate authority in society. And this is going to come to you guys eventually as well. You need to work to stop this now, right? And here it is, July 1791. The king actually also tries to escape. Unfortunately for him, he tries to escape like a king in his royal carriage with all the comforts of royalty. And he's discovered in Varennes, and he's forced to come back to Paris to assume his role as a king in this new constitution, where he is the king of the French, right? But by this point, it's very, very clear that um, you know the authority figure in the new system, the king, who is supposed to be the executive, is actually against the system, and that all the French aristocracy are now actually trying their hardest, essentially, to get all of the um, monarchic forces, the dynastic forces around Europe, to come and to essentially invade France and to stop this process, to stop this revolutionary process, to stop this idea, essentially, this new idea of popular sovereignty and national will and a nation state. So, what happens is that after September 1791, these increasing fears and conflicts, right? The French nation state, just as CS says, sees those aristocrats literally as foreigners. They've proven themselves at this point in their eyes as being treasonous, as being enemies of the French people in going and asking their family. Leopold II, the Emperor of Austria, is actually the brother of Marie Antoinette, who's married to Louis XVI. These aristocrats going basically to tell their family to come and help them against the French nation, right? And those emperors and monarchs around Europe, um, they don't quite want to get involved in these internal affairs of France. Um, but they also want to find a way of getting all of the French aristocracy off their back. So they try to do it. By with these equivocating kind of formulations of saying Leopold II says, well, look, if all the monarchs agree and come together for us to go and invade France, fine, I will do it. But he's actually thinking that won't really happen. At this point, things are too inchoate for the monarchs elsewhere in Europe to think that really their own authority and their own thrones are somehow at play in all of this. They're much busier trying to again play those games of the reason of state of expanding their own territories. So while all of this is happening, Russia and Austria come together to partition the last part of the remaining Polish kingdom. And that's what they're much more worried about. Um, but uh, there's this vague promise given to the French aristocracy that they're willing to actually go to France and to invade France. And the French, already seeing the aristocracy, their own aristocracy, as enemies, as foreigners, seeing themselves as surrounded by all of these states whose principle and whose way of thinking about authority is the very opposite of their own. And as they see it, the very opposite of what legitimate authority inherently is. Think the revolution will never be safe. The French nation state will never be safe unless everybody has the same thing that now we are trying to do in France. Unless the people are able to rule themselves everywhere, then the French people will never be able to rule themselves in France. And so in April 1792, the French themselves declare war, actually, against Austria, who is then joined by Prussia and eventually by Britain. And uh, Suddenly the revolution, this very often happens in the modern world in the context of these revolutions, that something that happens in a local domestic context becomes essentially an international context. In fact, the irony of all of this is that we use the word international, whereas in this context it's actually the first nation state fighting for the principle of nationality against these other states that whose authority is founded on a dynastic religious basis, and coming into the early modern world, as we've said, much more on a Machiavellian reason of state perspective, in which the state, through police measures, administers all of society and is simply focused on its own power, right? Um, so there's war, and as you might imagine, the war doesn't necessarily go very well for the French at the beginning. Why? Because who are most of the people who have been leading the soldiers and who have the highest posts, the highest military posts in government? They're members of the French aristocracy. So things go generally badly. And by July 1792, actually, it seems like the Austrians and the Prussians are on the verge of being able to invade all of France. And they even, there's a manifesto that they put out basically warning the French against doing anything bad to Louis the XVI. And this is one of the things that leads to the process of a second revolution, right? There is now a second revolution on August 10th, 1792, in which the constitutional monarchy that had been created through the constitution that comes into effect in 1789, 1791, that is scrapped, right? And there is now a new government which declares itself a republic. uh, this is why you see Louis the XVI's head being chopped off, right? The 1792 government says, no, we actually have to move in a completely new and different direction. No more kings. And from now on, in the kind of constitution that they try to pass, they give the vote actually to all adult males. Um, Again, something, a radical departure essentially in human history. And they're very aware of the fact that they're doing something unprecedented essentially in human history. Not only like the first revolutionaries of 1789 do they call the what had come previously the old regime versus this new state that they're going to try to ground on natural human national bases, they actually create a whole new calendar. So, from the founding of the Republic, right, in August 1792, they call that the year one. It means all of the whole calendar, right, uh, starts all over again. We're actually in the year one of the new era, right? The new era of the people truly actually ruling themselves. And they do a lot of other things, unlike the metric system, which is taken up by everybody else. They try to radically change people's perception of time and of order. So, one thing that they do, but when changing the calendar, um, they change the weeks, for example, again, trying to rationalize everything. They change the weeks into 10 days. So each month is 30 days made up out of 10, made of 3 weeks of 10 days. Um, each day is made up of 10 hours. Each hour is made up of 100 minutes. Each minute has 100 seconds, right? A full rationalizations. And the idea of the Rousseau idea that all we need of God is the idea of a supreme being that we all worship and to whom we owe a sense of virtue, which we owe essentially to our country, right, and to its laws. So there is this radical departure, the creation of uh, a new republic now in 1792. Um, but this doesn't resolve the problems because the military problems, even though they're resolved briefly, and so the invasion for some period of time stops, it picks up again. And by 1793, by the summer of 1793, the Republic is actually completely under siege. Um, so many of those departments, those newly created departments in France, have actually revolted against Paris. They don't like the fact that all rule is centralized now and directed from Paris. Um, they don't like what the revolution and the republic is doing in terms of religion, which is basically has the decision has been made to make all of the Catholic clergy into civil servants of the state, right? And so, for a variety of reasons, in certain departments, they feel that um, that the revolution has become way too radicalized now. For example, what it does with the king in beheading him in 1793. So, uh, by the summer of 1793, um, the French nation state finds itself with more around 60 of the 83 departments actually in revolt against the central government, and it's being invaded from all sides by the British and all of the different German princes, basically, of the German states, right? In what still at that time was the Holy Roman Empire. Um, and this is what leads to the period, the about 1 year period from the summer of 1793 to July 1794, which is referred to as the Terror. And maybe some of you have heard of this. Usually, the picture that we have of the French Revolution is precisely people's heads being chopped off like this. And in the terror, the whole the word terror is actually used because the idea of it is that it's supposed to be a terror of virtue. We are surrounded by enemies of the people, right? Those aristocrats and everybody else who is working actually against the nation, against the will of the nation. Once you see the will as united, right, and as one, then if anything is going wrong, it becomes very easy to say it's because we have enemies amongst us. And we have to find those enemies. We have to force people to be free. That language from Rousseau. And anybody who, in a way, has acted in a treasonous manner to the French people, well, they have to have their head chopped off. Now, the terror and the reason why people see this as, many people see this as the beginning of um, those nightmare situations in which supposedly we have an ideal of what society is supposed to be, and then horrible things happen to people as a result of that. So we're going to talk about Marx, and people associate that reality, especially with communism, right? The idea of a perfect society, and then in the name of that perfect society, you can commit genocide and you can kill very, very large numbers of people. And people go back to the terror as kind of the first real example of this. Many people, when they're writing about Machiavelli, talk about this idea of the end justifies the means, right? This terminology, which I think comes out of Wikipedia or something like that, doesn't apply really to Machiavelli. The end for Machiavelli is power itself, right? When we say the end justifies the means, we're saying, look, it's okay to have some people's heads chopped off if we can create something great for everybody, right? uh, the something great for Machiavelli is not what would be great for everybody, but just the power of the prince. But here the idea is if we get rid of the traitors to the people, right? If we get rid of the people who are putting asunder the rights of man, then we can actually create a collective will. Then we can create rule by the people. Then we can create the perfect society. And that's what the terror in a way saw itself as being engaged in doing. It's supposed to be a terror of virtue, forcing people actually to be free. And even though they pass a very, the most democratic constitution that had been created in the history of the world until that period, it's not actually practiced because the country is in an emergency. And so things are actually run by a committee called the Committee of Public Safety, which makes decisions basically by decree as to what needs to happen so the French nation state can actually protect itself. And in the terror, actually, the number of people who die by comparison to the people who die in other revolutionary contexts in which as Lenin said, to make eggs, you have to make an omelet, you have to break some eggs. In which many people are massacred, supposedly for a better society to come into place. The number in the terror is relatively small. About 17,000 officially people die, probably overall around 40,000. Most of them actually ordinary people, peasants. Um, but the terror also puts to death some of the great thinkers of the Enlightenment, actually, who had joined the revolution in an earlier phase of it. It puts to death, for example, Olympe de Gouges, that we read. Um, uh, and so this is a kind of scary part of the French Revolution, of the ominous aspect of the French Revolution for what is to come in world history in the 20th century, right? Which, when we read Hannah Arendt talking about in terms of, in the name of an ideological notion of we're going to create the perfect society, we actually end up massacring and large numbers of people, even committing genocide, right? The numbers in the terror are quite small. And if you look at it from another perspective, what the terror really does, and this 1 year in French history, is that it does something uh, in some ways unbelievable, which is the reason, as I already alluded to this when I was talking about the rights of man and the citizen in the previous lecture, which makes it which is the reason why the nation state as a form of government becomes the dominant, prevalent form of government to this day in the world. And the reason why that happens is because of what the terror actually achieves, which is not so much, executing people like Louis the 16th and other traitors to the revolution. It's actually being able to deploy all of the resources of the society, of arming essentially everybody in French society who is capable of fighting, mass conscription for the first time, the idea of a total war, right? This is what the terror actually achieves. By June 17, by the spring of 1794, um, basically the French nation state has more than 800,000 people under arms. And by June 1794, they've been able to essentially defeat both all of the revolts at home and the powers basically that have been trying to invade the French nation state. And from this point on, right, from this point on, the French, for a generation, essentially dominate the European continent. With this military force that has been created out of simply citizens fighting and dying for their country, not professional soldiers, although through their experiences, obviously they become very battle hardened troops, right? And this is what we associate, obviously, with Napoleon. You see here Napoleon crossing the Alps, a famous painting by Jacques-Louis David. Um, and here's Napoleon being coronated in 1804, very famously, you know, as a ceremonial. He has the Pope there to give him the throne, but instead of allowing the Pope to put the throne on his head, he takes up the throne and he puts it on his own head, as if to say, God did not give this to me, I gave this to myself, right? And you look at Napoleon's empire at its height, um, you see he has extended and the French territories and the French kingdom to include all of Holland and so much of what is Italy. Um, French satellites. You see all of Spain, so much of the territory of the different German states. He gets rid of the idea of the Holy Roman Empire, and he creates these small states basically that are beholden to the French. Um, and in fact, almost all of the European continent uh, is is either allied with him or under his control. The only power, in a way, that is not and continues fighting against Napoleon is Great Britain for the longest time until 1812, right? Um, but this story, right? How did we end up with Napoleon? Uh, Here, the whole French Revolution was supposedly this idea of creating popular sovereignty. And at the end of it, before the French are actually, and Napoleon is actually defeated by all of the dynastic states around Europe, um, here we end up with another emperor, right? So something in the story has clearly gone wrong, uh, at least the story with which the French Revolution began. And many people, many historians, uh, continue to debate, should we see Napoleon as a repudiation of the ideas of the French Revolution, or does he continue somehow to be an expression of them? But why is he there in the first place? Why do we end up with the rule of a general, which is that's what Napoleon was. He was the first general essentially of the French Republic. First, he made himself into the first council. He created a new system of government. And then he did that in 1799. In 1804, he made himself emperor. But why does that become even possible? Well, uh, that has to do with this question, which, let me see,
Yes.
this question of who exactly are the people, right? Because once the French Revolution breaks out, right, the question is, well, we have to get rid of the foreigners, right? Those people who are looking out for their own special privileges rather than the collective will of the nation based on human rights. This is what we see in Sieyès. But then, very quickly, and this is the reason why there is so much internal conflict in the revolution, which is why it becomes radicalized, is that very quickly the question becomes not only the simple one of who is it that doesn't identify with us and with the French nation, but who gets to constitute the French nation? Who gets to be part of the group of people who decide for everybody, who can think for everybody? And that's where we ended last time when we were talking about, can women do that? Can people who don't have property do that? Can they think for everybody? Can they think for the people, right? And this is the fundamental question that then starts to drive people apart in the French Revolution, because the revolution, as you see in the rights of man and citizen, it's carried out in the name of property and property rights. And CS talks about why are the third estate everything? Because they are the productive people. They are the ones who actually have some merit and some value and give something to the country. And you can tell that by the fact that they actually have attained property through the productive process, through the exchanges in the marketplace. So, is it the case that the real people, the people who have the merit to actually think for the people, are the people who have property, right? Um, and the people who started the French Revolution certainly believed in that. But very, very soon, the people who are actually fighting on behalf of the French nation are much more ordinary people, those workers in the workshops, in the cities, the sans-culottes, the people who don't wear breeches like the aristocrats do, right? And those people are not fighting for some notion of, well, you are better than me because you have more money than me. The very, very opposite. They think of the whole idea of actually having democracy is to have a state that actually that can attend to the interests of the people who don't have money, right? That can serve the interests of the people who are not already at the very, very top of the society. So, who are the people who should decide? Should it be those ordinary people and their common concerns and their attempts actually to make their situation better, even if they don't already have property? Or is it the people who have property because that property represents some kind of merit on their part, some kind of value that they've added to the society? And it's the conflict between these conceptions of who the people are that constantly radicalizes the revolution, leads to different factions coming to power at different times. And at the end, why does a military leader like Napoleon take over power? Because this is the only way, in a sense, in which order and stability can still be maintained in the society. And this is something that we'll see over and over again, and I'm going to talk about it very briefly in the next half century, in which the people of property and ordinary people, the people who eventually become the working class, the proletariat that Marx talks about, they make a revolution together against the privileged, against the aristocracy, and then they can't quite actually come to agreement on what the state and the society should look like and who are the people who actually can think for everyone. And then as a result, you have some authoritarian figure come and essentially take away democracy again and say, okay, if we're going to have order, then we can't actually have this debate about who the people are. That's not to say that Napoleon um, just throws out all of the ideals of the revolution altogether. No, he creates the Napoleonic Code, which is the idea, which is the laws actually apply to everybody, regardless of who you are. The code actually continues to be at the heart of French law to this day. Um, and he creates the idea of you rise through your talents. So it's not that somebody actually was born the Duke of so and so and they have some privileges. No. Um, the state will decide who are the talented, who do have merit, and all positions are open to talent. And even when in his imperial period, Napoleon creates a new kind of aristocracy. It's supposed to be an aristocracy of merit now. It's no longer supposed to be an aristocracy of birth and of privilege. This is why historians talk about, is Napoleon, does he represent a continuation of the French Revolution in some ways, in that he tries to also then apply this idea throughout all of the territories that France has conquered? Or is he, as an emperor, an anti democratic figure, and so going against the ideals of the French Revolution? Like I said, though, the pattern, the ordinary people and the property make the revolution against the aristocracy together in the name of the nation state. Then they can't quite agree on what that will look like. Some kind of authoritarian figure takes over. Um, this is a pretty common pattern, essentially, from here on out until certainly 1848 when Marx is writing the Communist Manifesto. And there are different interpretations of this, right? One interpretation we've already read. That's the Kantian one, right? Remember, Kant said, if you try to ever change things actually through a revolution, you'll get nowhere because all you'll do is just change the people at the bottom and the top, but you won't ever really change society through a revolution. And so the fact that at the end of a revolution, you end up with a military figure. Look at this even in our world. This is not something that's 200 years old. Look at what happened in the Arab Spring, for example, right? Revolutions happen, and look at in Egypt, you ended up with essentially a military takeover, right? So this is a relatively common pattern. And from the Kantian perspective, this just shows you that violence and revolution won't actually change things. That's one interpretation. But there's a sense in which things had radically changed. Even after all of the dynastic states finally come together and they defeat Napoleon, and in the Congress of Vienna, they try to restore basically the order that had existed uh, beforehand. The very way in which they try to do it shows that things actually have radically changed, right? Because before, the problem amongst European states was they were playing this game of how can I conquer more and more territory, get more territory for the state, so can I administer more and more territories, right? Um, this idea of the power of the state as its own end. Well, in the Congress of Vienna, the focus is now on all of the dynastic states essentially coming together and saying, we now actually have to work together to make sure that this idea that came out of the French Revolution, the idea of the people have the right to rule themselves, the idea of the nation state, that this doesn't actually happen again, that it doesn't spread, that it doesn't go all around Europe, right? Because if it does, then we've already seen what could happen, right? We really now understand that our thrones are essentially in play, that we could lose our power because the very basis of our power as coming from God is being fundamentally questioned. And if all of our people end up wanting the same thing, to have societies that can only legitimately be run in their name, we're going to lose our power, right? So the ironic thing is the first really international organization of states that come together to maintain order, right? Just the concert of Europe, as it's called after the Congress of Vienna, they actually it comes into being to try to prevent the idea of nationality. And so in a way it comes into being against the idea of an international order. Okay. All right. uh, what is they fail in that everywhere, and these are the You see liberty leading the people. This is another revolution that breaks out in France in 1830 because in France, after the Restoration, after they get rid of Napoleon, there's basically a constitutional monarchy which gives the vote to very, very, very few people, like one out of every 60 adult males. But there is a constitution, and the Napoleonic Code is actually maintained. So when a king, Charles IX, comes to power in 1824 that tries to actually take things back into the old order, there is a revolution in 1830. Um, then in 1848, again, the concert of Europe had come together to try to stamp out national revolutions wherever they might happen. They did it, for example, here in Spain in 1818 when they sent a French force basically that quelled an attempt at a constitutional monarchy here in Spain in 1823. But this attempt generally fails. And by 1848, there are revolutions all across Europe, national revolutions. They again start in France. and they start in France to try to extend actually the democracy and the franchise. Instead of, even after the revolution of 1830, the vote had just been extended to the property. So 1 out of every 30 adult males, right? And now there is, in 1848, referred to as the springtime of the peoples, an attempt to take the idea of the French Revolution. The people should rule themselves, and there are revolutions all across the European continent to do this. In the German states, right? In France, um, and these revolutions also fail, uh, and they fail partly for exactly the same reason we've talked about. The bourgeoisie, the propertied, make the revolution together with the workers. Now we're in the era already of industrialization by 1848. And so we can really talk about them as the working classes. And they make the revolution together. And again, they fall out. So there's a revolution in February 1848 in France. And then in June, there's another attempt at a revolution, this time on the part of workers wanting social rights and a social state, rather than simply formal political rights of I get to vote, right? No, the state should be there to make sure that everybody actually is employed and has a decent standard of living, etc. Right? Which means you might have to actually infringe on the property of those people who do have a lot of capital and property, right? And so in France, you end up through that division between people, ultimately with another Napoleon coming to power. Louis Napoleon, who is the nephew of Napoleon, um, he first becomes the president of the new republic after 1848, and then he makes himself into emperor, into Napoleon III, right? And all across Europe, the divisions between the people who make the revolution means that the dynastic states actually are able to reclaim power after a short period of time by the end of 1849. Marx is writing precisely at this moment, right? This is when he writes the Communist Manifesto. And so he has a different interpretation of why it is that you don't end up with democratic nation states after revolutions like in France and then all across Europe until 1848. His explanation is uh, it's class struggle. The reason why there is not any national will that people can easily arrive at is because Europe, in the French Revolution, what it really did was create the first capitalist nation state, but that was bound from the start to go against the interests of ordinary working people. And so naturally, the revolution could never stabilize itself and ended up with a military leader. And the same thing is true today. The rule of property, which is how Marx looks at what happens in the creation of the French Revolution, for him is not democratic, right? All of these formal rights of, oh, you can vote, etc., mean nothing when the distribution of property in society works out in such a way that some people end up with everything and other people end up with nothing. And so for him, that pattern of why it is that you end up after a revolution with some kind of emperor, some kind of authoritarian ruler, goes back to the fact that really what happened in the French Revolution was the creation of the rule of property, right? Which idealized itself in all of this notion of human rights and the creation of the popular will. But the reality of what it created was the rule of property, capitalism. And then the reality of people actually trying to fight for their own rights meant that you ended up with an authoritarian ruler to create order, right? So that is the alternative. One interpretation of why is it that we end up with authoritarian rulers despite this idea of the people ruling themselves, is the Kantian one. Violence doesn't actually change things. The other one is the Marxist one, and his argument is it's because actually the nation state um, is not a collective will, it's a locus of class struggle, right? So I'm going to stop here for this video, and I'm going to move on to talk about Marx and then what he says about his work in the Communist Manifesto and class warfare after I've provided you this the political sense of where we are in Europe in 1848 when Marx writes.